Welcome to the Mathematicians Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we are basking in the glow of an astronomer, Autolycus of Pitane, a man who got the ball rolling on spherical geometry. I love hairy balls. And at last I find myself with the opportunity to talk about them at length. In particular, I like balls that have swarms of bacteria on them. Now, I know what you're thinking, that must be some really bacteria-ridden balls, but you'd be underestimating. My preferred balls have so much bacteria that there is a difficulty in motion for the self-motile rod-shaped bacteria. We all know that bacteria generally moves in a straight line, but what does that mean when it's constrained to the surface of a ball? We also know that as two bacteria approach each other, they send out chemical markers which the other picks up on. They then slowly turn to move away from each other to avoid collision. So how does that pattern translate to a swarm of them, where everyone is attempting to move in a straight line, but also away from everyone else, but then also constrained to the surface of a ball? Well, I know exactly what you're thinking. You are thinking that this sounds awfully familiar and has been plagiarized from another source. And you'd be right. So, let me be the first and possibly only person to ever cite the master's thesis of a younger Benjamin Cornish in math. Because this particular question is one I worked on slavishly for the better part of a year. To summarise my findings, they all converge on a quasi-flow, that is, they act like a fluid whilst not being a fluid, in order to reduce the, let's just say, entropy of changing directions. There's an emergence of a uniform direction. However, this is complicated by the constraint of the sphere, because as we all know from typing hairy balls into a Google image search, it is evident that you cannot have uniform flow on a sphere. In other words, it's impossible to have every path line of a bacteria in a continuously deformed spectrum. Or yet, in other still more simplified words, if you had a hairy ball, you cannot brush the hair so that it looks neat. There is always at least a sum pole of order 2. That is either 2 tufts, or perhaps a tuft and a crown, or that third option which we won't discuss that is an order 2 pole. Don't look it up. So what do the bacteria do? Well, for the full story, you can email me and I will gladly send you a copy of my thesis, and you can be the third person to ever read it. But in short, I think the minimal entropy system is a bit like the line on a tennis ball. It's sort of like a wonky circle that goes up and down, and they all sort of follow that kind of conga pattern. But I know for certain that I am not the first mortal to ever wonder how something might move across a sphere. Which brings us nicely on to Autolycus of Pitane. Now, Autolycus of Pitane is not a household name, unless your household is particularly enthusiastic about ancient Greek science. But his contributions to both mathematics and astronomy were significant, and his ideas have had more staying power than you might expect from someone who lived over 2 millennia ago. If you've ever looked up at the night sky and marvelled at the steady movement of the stars, you've engaged, perhaps unknowingly, with one of Autolycus's most enduring mathematical explorations. So let's set the scene. It's about 360 BCE, Plato is still alive, the Academy is flourishing, Aristotle is starting to get on everyone's nerves, and a young baby is born, in contrast to all the old babies that were being born at this time. And Mummy and Daddy of Pitane decided to call him Autolycus, which translates to the wolf itself. I don't know if that's relevant for his life, but it's pretty metal. Pitane, a city in Aeolis, modern-day Turkey, is where Autolycus is born. We don't know much about his life. No dramatic exiles, no political intrigue, no scandals, at least none that the history has chosen to record. Maybe he was the rock star of early geometricians and we just lost all the papyrus tabloids. One fun point of interest is that he taught the philosopher Arcesilaus, who went on to found skepticism. So, take from that what you will about Autolycus's teaching style. What we do have are his works, and unlike many of his contemporaries, a good chunk of them survived. That alone makes him remarkable, considering how much ancient knowledge was lost over the centuries. His most famous surviving works are On the Moving Sphere and On Risings and Settings, both of which are among the earliest Greek mathematical texts to reach us intact. At this point, I should engage in some self-reflection. I have set myself some natural turning points in the history of mathematics, mostly for my own organisation and motivation. But in this first series, I have intended to work from Ames to Euclid, as this represented the period between the first surviving works and the first works that are still in publication. We have the Rhind Papyrus, as we explored in episode 1, and this still exists in the British Museum as an artefact. We discussed already how it is possibly the oldest original work of mathematics, at least one that has a name associated with it. And as for Euclid's Elements, I've said before that this is the oldest work that is still in print. I have a copy on my bookshelf. The trouble is, this is not entirely true. I mean, for one, you can still buy Plato's works, which discuss mathematics quite heavily, although, for reasons discussed in episode 12, I don't count these as works of mathematics. But more pertinently for today's episode, Euclid was pipped to the post by Autolycus, who published only a decade or so earlier the works of On a Moving Sphere and On Risings and Settings. I would argue that these are still extant. Wikibooks has a fully published manuscript from 1885. For those of you who can discerte, legere et scribere Latin, that is, read and write in Latin, or the American University of Beirut published an English translation in 1971, which you can still buy on Amazon. Sadly, I'm not yet sponsored by the American University of Beirut, but I'm sure that email will come in any day now. So, as it turns out, Euclid was not the first work still available. In order to learn something, you must begin by not knowing it. Well, unless you believe what Plato tells us about recollection. But hey, I made a mistake. Sadly, Autolycus' work is not as interesting as Euclid, so Euclid is still going to be my turning point next episode. Now, On the Moving Sphere is a deceptively simple title. But don't be fooled. It lays out the fundamental principles of spherical astronomy, an essential stepping stone towards understanding celestial motion. The entire treatise is built on a single idea. If a sphere moves uniformly about its centre, every point on it follows a circular path in a fixed plane. In other words, Autolycus was formulating the rules that govern how celestial bodies appear to move from our perspective here on Earth. This might seem obvious today, but at the time it was innovatory to put it in rigorous mathematical terms. The notion that celestial bodies move in predictable mathematical ways is one of the tenets of astronomy. You can see this idea in action in everything from planetary orbits to the way satellites move around Earth today. In the classroom, whenever a student brings in a football, I challenge them to spin it in 2 directions at once. Now, this feels naturally quite achievable. We have 2 hands, they both rotate. But it's a good teaching opportunity to show that you can only rotate a sphere about a single axis at once. This is, in essence, what Autolycus is trying to show, as the single axis of rotation would produce a single great circle. What's particularly intriguing is that Autolycus' work anticipates later developments in spherical geometry and trigonometry. His approach to On the Moving Sphere is purely geometric. He describes how points on a sphere behave when rotated, but he doesn't yet have the full formal machinery of trigonometry to work with. That would come later with Hipparchus and Ptolemy. But let's step back for a second. Why does this matter? Well, if you've ever used a globe, you've engaged the very principles Autolycus laid down. Every time we track a satellite, navigate using the stars, or even watch a basketball spin through the air, we're dealing with rotational motion on a sphere. And while modern mathematics gives us more powerful tools, the basic ideas are unchanged. The uniform rotation principle Autolycus described is still key in fields as diverse as physics, engineering, and even computer graphics. Ever wondered how video game developers get planets to rotate realistically in space simulators? Well, maybe they don't. But if they did, you'd have Autolycus to thank for that. I doubt many game developers are purchasing the 1885 Latin translation, though. They'll probably go for the English translation from the University of Beirut. Subscribe now for 50% extra at the University of Beirut. Okay, so great. Things move in circles on spheres. So what? Well, this should predict that if the heavens, by which we mean the sun, the moon, the stars, are actually painted on a giant dome that encases the Earth, a la the Truman Show, then they should all trace out circles. But they don't. However, some of them nearly do. On a night-by-night basis, most of the smaller ones, let's just call them the stars, will rotate around a circle. And hey, look, the North Star appears to be the centre of those circles. Okay, although, spoiler alert, the stars change depending on summer or winter, so clearly there's something else going on. Also, the sun and moon, the big ones in the sky, these definitely do move in circles, although the circles drift quite considerably in size in summer and winter. But they still point to the North Star as well, so that's something. Also, something weird is going on with the moon, where sometimes you can see all of it and sometimes you can't see very much of it at all. And then also, back to the small ones, those stars, 5 of them, in fact, follow a different path from the rest. They sort of wander about, and they sometimes go backwards. Let's call these ones the wanderers, or if we were to borrow the Greek word for wanderer, we might call them planets. Also, about these other stars, I mean, yes, they do follow really crisp circles around the North Star, but where did the one that looked like a bull go? It was here 6 months ago and now it's gone. So that's another different type of motion that we have to track on top of the circle. So big circles, yes, it's a nice theory and it's a great place to start, but clearly it's not the entire story. Autolycus' second major work, On Risings and Settings, dawns on another fundamental aspect of celestial motion, the apparent motion of stars as they rise and set in the night sky. Now, if you've ever watched a sunset, you might think, well, the sun rises, the sun sets, big deal. But for ancient Greek mathematicians, this was a puzzle to be solved with geometric precision. The key question was this: given a star's position and the rotation of the celestial sphere, when will it rise above the horizon, and when will it set? And how can we predict these movements mathematically? This was important not just for intellectual curiosity, but also for navigation, timekeeping, even agriculture. Autolycus provided systematic proofs for when stars appear and disappear from view, based on how their relationship to the observed horizon. His work made clear that these movements were orderly and predictable, strengthening the argument that the heavens operated according to rational mathematical laws. This idea would later be a critical assumption for astronomers like Ptolemy and Copernicus. Today, the study of risings and settings is a crucial part of observational astronomy. Whether you're planning the best time to view a meteor shower, aligning a telescope, or launching a satellite, you're engaging with the same principles Autolycus explored over 2,000 years ago. Even modern planetariums rely on algorithms that owe something to his method. One of the most fascinating things about On Risings and Settings is its proof-oriented approach. Unlike other traditions that describe celestial movements more narratively, Autolycus built a logical, rigorous framework for predicting them. This was an important step towards the fully mathematical models of the cosmos that would come later. In other words, he didn't just star-gaze, he star-thought, and indeed star-proved. So, what is Autolycus' legacy? While he clearly isn't famous, his work had a significant influence on later Greek and Hellenistic mathematicians, particularly Hipparchus and Ptolemy. His clear deductive style set a precedent for later mathematical astronomy, and his texts were used for centuries as reference material. More than that, his ideas about motion and celestial mechanics formed a lens through which we view the universe today, although not literally. The principles he explored apply not just to stars and planets, but to any rotating system, from gyroscopes to quantum mechanics. one could say he developed non-Euclidean geometry before Euclidean geometry, although for reasons unknown he chose not to call it as such. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me on this gaze at the life and works of Autolycus of Pitane. If you enjoyed this, then don't forget to subscribe to the Mathematicians podcast for more detailed discussion about the key figures who shaped our world. You can also follow the pod on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod for all my off-topic thoughts. Next week, it's the big one. You could go and read his books in the library for yourself, or Euclid. Just wait until next week as we discuss Euclid of Alexandria. Until then, goodbye! The music today is Danse Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.